Hi, welcome to AFC's webinar on related services and supports in New York City Public Schools. We're going to give people a few minutes to come in. Hi, welcome to AFC's Related Services and Supports in New York City Public Schools. We're going to give a few more minutes for people to come in. Thanks for coming. We do have a Q&A where you can put your questions and we'll try to answer them as we go along. There also will be a recording of this that we'll send out afterwards. And we'll get started in just a few minutes. A transcript of this will also be available. Okay, well, we're a small group, but let's get started. I'm Kim Madden from Advocates for Children of New York. I'm the Director of Family Supports at Advocates for Children. I've been here over 15 years, and I'm also a public school parent of a child in high school who is in an ICT and gets a lot of related services. Joining me today from AFC are Liliana Diaz-Pedrosa and Karen Herrera, and they'll be staffing the Q&A. So as you have questions that come up, please post them in there. We will be putting a link to the survey that we have in the end of this presentation, but also in the beginning at some point. If you take that and put in your name and your email address, we'll be sure to send you a copy of the PowerPoint. This will also get posted on our YouTube account. Okay, so thank you so much for coming. Oh. Sorry, hold on, I'm having some technical difficulties. There we go. All right, so what we're going to cover today are an introduction about Advocates for Children. We're going to go through some of the types of related services. We're going to talk about how you know if your related services are being provided. That's something that I think it's sometimes tricky for parents to know. And then what to do if you find out that you're not receiving all the services on your child's IEP. And problem solving after that. We will be taking questions at the end, and then also feel free to put your questions in the Q&A, as I said before. Okay, so Advocates for Children is an organization that's been around for over 50 years. We're an independent agency and we protect the rights of New York City students. We focus on public school students. We have a helpline that is available Monday to Thursday, 10 to 4. We also have a website with a lot of guides and resources that's available. And we do workshops and trainings like this. And we provide legal services to low-income families. And to access that, you call into our helpline. Okay, we also have a lot of different webinars on our YouTube site. And this recording will be posted on there, and there's other ones on there as well. Okay, so starting with what are related services. They can really run the gamut. I think one of the things to keep in mind with related services is that they're really to help support a student with a disability with whatever they need to help them progress in school. So sometimes people think of special education as a special class, as an ICT or a self-contained class, but it's really the whole range of services and supports. And I think related services are very important to that. Some types of related services that we typically see, these are the most frequent ones: physical therapy, occupational therapy, which is like physical therapy, but it's more for fine motor. Physical therapy is more for gross motor skills. Occupational therapy can also be sometimes organizational skills and things like that. Speech therapy, which can really be a lot of different things, everything from social skills groups and helping people communicate or helping them with organizing ideas, to actual more physical speech therapy. So for the student who has an oral motor reason for why speech is difficult for them. Sometimes you see assistive technology specialists, and they could be under a few different ones of these, but they often are speech therapists. Counseling services are services to help students with emotional issues, behavioral issues, things like that. Assistive technology and devices, I just mentioned, sometimes that overlaps with a speech therapist, or an OT therapist can also have a specialty in that. Hearing and vision services, nursing, orientation and mobility services, and transportation. I think sometimes people don't think of transportation as being a related service, but it is a service and an accommodation that helps students get to school, and which a lot of students in New York City need because of their disability. So they're not able to take public transportation. And this, of course, is not the complete list. And within each category, there might be subspecialties. For example, there's specialized kinds of speech therapy like prompt. So this is just kind of a general overview of the types of related services we see. Other things that I often think of as related services, but legally and from a DOE systems perspective are a little bit different, are paraprofessionals, special education teacher support services. That's a special education teacher, or SETs, and language supports. So sometimes if they don't have a bilingual class that a student needs, they're supposed to be providing an alternate placement para who speaks the language of the student and can try to help as an interpreter and translator for what's going on in the classroom. Now, when I'm talking about related services, in general, almost everything I'm saying applies to this group as well. But I just wanted to point out that it's a little bit different. And we'll talk about that in terms of trying to understand if your child's getting these services, or what to do if they're not. Okay. So related services are provided in different ratios and locations. If you look on your child's IEP, you'd see, is it individual? Is it group? And they should be very specific. So for example, social skills groups with a speech therapist are often in a small group, maybe 3 students, 4 students. SETs you often see in a ratio that's greater than that. But if a student needs individualized SETs, or any ratio in particular, there's maximum set by state law, but there's not a minimum. So the ratios and the locations of services should be based on what your child needs. Small group therapy or SETs, I guess I just went through that part. So you can ask for more individualized therapies. And location, you'll see push in or pull out on an IEP. Push in means that the therapist is going into the classroom with a student, and pull out means they're taking them out. This should be based on your child's needs. Far too often we hear from parents where they're being told that something has to be push in or pull out, and they disagree and they're asking why. And it has to do more with what's going on with the supports in the school, and not because of the schedule. And also, you don't want to have your child pulled out. One of the complaints we get sometimes is, for example, with SATs, somebody might need SATs because they're struggling in math. And it generally would not make sense to have that sets teacher pull the child out during math. I mean, it might, but it would, if they were making that decision, it would have to be based on what your child needs, not on a school scheduling issue. And so that's something that sometimes takes a lot of conversations and trying to figure out why are decisions being made this way. But keep in mind that the I in the IDEA, which is the federal law that protects students with disabilities, and the I in the IEP, which is the individualized education program that comes out of the IDEA, that I stands for individualized, and it's supposed to be individualized based on what your child needs. So also pullout should make sense. And this is something that can be really tough, especially if you have a child in elementary school, for example, where there's no such thing as a free period, making sure that if they're going to be pulling out your child, that it makes sense. So for example, should physical therapy be during art class? Should speech be during English? If they're going to be doing, does that make sense? That might make sense for push in. For pull out, maybe you want to have that done during a non-academic time. So just keeping an eye on that and making sure it makes sense. Okay, one thing we get asked a lot is, how do I know who my child's providers are? Now, obviously, the best thing to do is to be in communication with your school, but some people have a harder time getting in touch with their schools. One thing that's new this year is that you can get a lot more information on My Student Portal. Sometimes you'll hear this referred to by the DOE as NYCSA, which it took me forever to figure out what that meant, but that's actually how they're pronouncing NYCSA, which stands for New York City Student Account. And so your NYCSA account or your My Student Portal, if you don't have access to it, you should speak to your school and try to get into it. It's an online program, and with it you can see what's listed on the IEP. You can see transportation for students that are older or in high school. You can look at graduation tracker to see where they're on track for, with the caveat that they don't include the different ways in which students with disabilities can graduate, but it's something to look at. And it has a lot of information on here. So for example, if you're looking under IEP and you're trying to understand, well, what are my child's services? What does the school think they're supposed to be providing? Obviously, the document that controls that the most is the last IEP for your child. But you can look here and see what kind of services do they have listed, and who's the provider. So for example, for this student, they have occupational therapy 4 times a week. It's individual. You can see the first start date. You can see the last date that services were delivered, and the provider name is blacked out, but that's there. So you could say, oh, I thought it was this person, or you may know the person, but it's good to see. One thing I wanted to point out is for this last one, for the speech language therapy, you can see that even though everything else is from April, it looks like the last documented service for this speech and language therapist was in September. One thing you'd want to look at here is there's a little blue asterisk. I don't know if you can quite see that, but if you look down the bottom, the speech language therapist was a contracted agency, not a DOE employee. And for some reason, I'm hoping this is something that DOE can fix, but it doesn't look like the services got updated. So this student was in fact receiving speech and language therapy, but the systems did not reflect it. But if you're looking it up for your child, this is a good place to look. If you see something like this where it looks like the last documented service was a while ago, it's certainly worth asking. It may be a data entry error, but it's worth checking and making sure, did this person go on leave and no one remembered to tell me, or whatever it is. But it's one place to look for information that's new this year. Bus accommodations. So this is something that in the past parents would get. Wow, I'm already forgetting the color. I think it was yellow or green, but you would get a letter on colored paper home that would say what your bus route was. And that was usually the only way you would know, how is my child going to get to school this year? Now it's all online. Some schools were contacting parents, but you can look, a couple weeks before the start of school, or at least, before the start of school, and see, I would definitely double check and see, are all the accommodations right? You know, so for this is a student who uses a wheelchair, if they didn't have wheelchair, or they didn't have 2 seats and the student needed another adult to accompany him to school, you'd want to make sure that was on there. But you can see the route number, the transportation company, and it's a place to see, you know, what's going on with that. Other things that we get asked about sometimes are, how do you know if a therapist is licensed? This tends to come up more frequently when people are looking for private providers, although certainly, you know, I think it's possible the DOE could hire somebody who, or a private school could hire somebody who isn't appropriately licensed. If you want to look up whether or not someone's licensed, it is available on a website that is maintained by the state. It's on the bottom here. As I said, we will be sending the PowerPoint where you can click on these links to everybody. Please fill out the survey with your name and your email address, and we'll make sure to send it to you. But here you could just look up by license and then put in their name and see if they were licensed if you were looking this up. This is obviously only for certain licenses. So for therapists, for example, if you're looking up a special education teacher, there's a different website for that. So the teacher one is here, and you would put in the first name and last name. Keep in mind if somebody changed their name, this may not be updated, but you can usually see, and with teachers, for example, we have seen situations where a teacher is teaching out of license, or they're a special education teacher, but they're not certified for that grade level or for that subject. So it's certainly something to look up and check. Another place to look and understand more information about the related services or the special education services that are being provided at your child's school. And this is a little tricky. I know it's a very busy slide. It's from the DOE's website under school quality reports. And if you click on that, if you look up a school right on the first page of the DOE, find a school, and then that school webpage shows up, on it, you'll see something for school quality reports. And if you click on that, you have to click kind of in the middle of the screen for supportive environment. It took me a while to remember that's where it is. But on that screen, if you scroll down a little bit, you'll see what the percentage of students with IEPs, what percentage of them are receiving their services in full. So I think this one I looked up last month, and this is new that they're including this. Unfortunately, I don't see any date on here, so I'm hoping it's something that they keep up to date. This was a high school. I just randomly looked up a high school that we had actually gotten a call about. And as you can see, it's pretty bad numbers. So if I was a parent at this school, I would be concerned because only 38% are receiving their special education programs in full. And this was definitely well after the start of the school year. So probably not a data entry issue. And then also looking at students, were they receiving their recommended services? Only 77% were receiving them in full. So that's something, it doesn't mean that your child is not getting their services. Obviously, you could be one of the lucky 38% who were receiving it in full. But it is something that I would say would lead me as a parent to at least be asking more questions about what's going on, and talking to the teachers, to the therapists, to anybody you know at that school, and trying to make sure you're really aware of what's happening. We always hope schools will be very forthcoming with parents about not providing things. And I think the DOE as a whole, that's certainly their policy. But in practice, we sometimes see schools not wanting to point out that there's a problem. Another thing that comes up a lot that we get asked is, how do you know if a school has SETS, an ICT, or a small class? Now, I know this is on related services, but because many people think of SETS as a related service, I wanted to cover it here. And so this is under school quality reports. You have to click on the school quality guide. and not the snapshot. This is very, it's a little bit confusing, but if you click around on the DOE website and follow these directions, you can find it. You'll see something that says student with disabilities. And if you click on there, you can see, for example, this school looks like their main way of providing special education services is through an ICT. They have less than 5 students getting self-contained settings and only 6 students getting sets out of 97 students with disabilities. So the school as a whole is most likely a lot larger, but you can see here that this is a school that very much preferenced ICT. Now, a child's IEP, as I said earlier, is always supposed to be based on what a child needs individually. But in reality, we often see schools recommending what they have. So this is something to look at. Certainly you can push back. Certainly the DOE as a whole has different resources. And we have seen many cases where parents are fighting for something different for what they feel like their child needs. For example, if they felt like their child really needed sets or they needed more support of a self-contained setting, going up the chain, which we'll talk about at the end, can often result in that working out. And this is just a way for you to get some more information. Okay, so let's say you go through all these steps, you look up stuff online, you're already getting a bad feeling. Your child, if they're as unreliable a reporter as mine, you sometimes wonder. My son from a very early age realized he didn't really want to tell me if there was a problem at school because he's very loyal. He loves the people, his teachers, his related service providers. Occasionally he will, but let's say you're digging into it and you're like, you're not really getting your full sets or OT or whatever it is. Then what? One thing you can ask for, and this is very concrete, is a voucher or makeup services. So a voucher means you actually get a piece of paper that enables you to find a provider who has the right license and the DOE will pay them. And that's for related services. It's called an RSA. For sets, it's called a P3 and a P4. The P4 is another, these two forms go together. So one is you fill it out when you found a special education teacher, and the other one is what they're submitting when they want to be paid. And then a P1 is if you didn't receive the small class on the IEP. So just to go through these categories in a little bit more detail, an RSA, as I said, is for related services. They're going to state on it, it's for occupational therapy. It's for whatever the related service is. The provider must be licensed with New York State. If you want somebody who's not licensed, you're probably going to have to go through a hearing and get a different, or at least get a payment order. It's going to be different than just getting an RSA. And you can ask for an increased rate. So a lot of times what we find is that the DOE rate, which the last I checked, and I know they were talking about raising them, but it was $90 an hour, is a bit below market value to a lot below market value, depending on the specialty you're talking about. So if you've called down the list, and we'll talk about where to find the list, but if you're calling down the list of providers that the DOE has, or you're reaching out all over the place and you really can't find somebody at that rate, but you found somebody at $120 an hour, keep a list of everybody who you weren't able to get through to, or who said they wouldn't take it, and you can keep asking for an increased rate. The same thing is true for P3s and P4s. I would say it's actually much more frequently needed that you need an increased rate because that rate is really low. And for P1s, that's a little bit different. It's being paid for the entire school year. It's being payment for a private school. You have to be accepted by the non-public school that is allowed to take the classification on your child's IEP. And the program has to be somewhat similar. I think one of the things that people think sometimes is they found a great private school, they have a P1, but the private school doesn't have a seat. That's not something that the P1 can help get around. And with all of these, unfortunately, it's a lot of work for the parent to try to find the provider and to make sure that everything lines up and to try to keep things moving smoothly. On the other hand, you can sometimes find a great provider who can come to your home, or a great school that will fit. For the P1, one thing I realized we didn't have on here is that it's only for the current school year. If you receive it after March 15th, you can also use it for the next school year. But that's something that sometimes parents are really concerned about. Usually people are using a P1 for a private school if they feel like a private school is what their child really needs, and they feel like the DOE should have recommended a private school at the IEP meeting, and they're planning to fight for that going forward. And I said down here, check expiration dates. Actually, on the most recent RSAs and P3s I've seen, and the forms change, and I've also seen different forms in the same school year. So I think there's some different things floating around. I didn't see an expiration date. I saw a number of sessions per week. And I think the general understanding is that it's good for that school year. But obviously, if you're getting a P3 now, a P3 or an RSA now, and you didn't get related services all school year, you're going to want to try to confirm with whoever you're getting that from that you can use it next school year. Try to get that in writing, because obviously you have about a month left to use them. And if you're talking about a lot of makeup services, it's important to try to get in writing how long you can use an RSA for, or a P3. Okay, so how to find a provider. This is actually, one of the reasons why a lot of times what people are asking for with related services are not a voucher, but they're asking for the DOE to find and make up services. But that's going to depend on each family, each situation, each student. If you do want a private provider to come, you can look up on the DOE lists. And they have lists by every different type of provider, or not every different type of provider, but the most common types of providers. And these are people who say they'll take the RSAs or the P3s. In my own personal and professional experience, I've found that list not so accurate. A lot of times providers don't reply, or they say, I don't know how I got on this list, or they're not willing to take a voucher, but it's certainly worth starting there. And sometimes you can find somebody. This should be obvious, but you should ask every provider you know. There are conflict rules. So if you have we had a great occupational therapist at school. I really wish she could have come and done services for us over the summer, but she was not allowed to because she was his therapist in school. And I think the DOE wants to make sure that therapists aren't sort of pushing to get private rates outside of school when maybe they can provide it themselves. And this honestly always boils down to money. An RSA is the most amount of money for the school system to pay. A school provider is the least, and contract agencies are in the middle. And to be honest, depending on your situation, you may really want the DOE provider. There's some great DOE providers. Sometimes it's a lot easier to just get it coordinated at school. But it doesn't mean, for example, with that occupational therapist, she probably has friends who are occupational therapists. And so I've asked, in my own personal experience, I've always asked everyone I know, do you know somebody? And I've also heard of people having great luck with asking private special education schools where there's no conflict, and maybe that provider gets off at 2:30 and wants to come to your house at 4 and provide services through an RSA. I think I talked about this earlier, but if you need an increased rate, you definitely want to write to the DOE. Often if you're getting a voucher, it will say on there the name of the person who issued it. It should say that in the email, and you can write to them and say, thank you so much. I got the RSA for OT. I had called, a dozen people on your list or 6 people on your list. None of them would take the RSA. I did find a provider who's available, who's appropriate, and she will only take the RSA at this rate. Is that something that I can get authorized? So you may have to fight depending on the rate and the situation a little bit more, but it's certainly worth asking if you do find somebody who's appropriate. Okay, language access rights. The DOE has to translate things in the top languages listed here. And you also have a right to interpretation services at school meetings and events. I think that they've made some progress, but sadly nowhere near enough. And obviously the system is complicated enough to understand if English is your first language. And if you speak another language, trying to understand an RSA form or an IEP or even a report card is challenging. And parents do have a right to get those documents translated and to have professional interpretation services at school meetings and events, not just bring your older child, which is sometimes what we see happening far too frequently. If you need help or know somebody who needs help with translation or interpretation, these are the two best ways to contact DOE centrally about it. And I certainly would encourage you to do that. Okay, so I'm going to pause here, and Liliana and Karen, if there's any questions that are coming up, definitely let me know. It doesn't look like we have many. Or if people do have questions, feel free to unmute yourself. This is being recorded, so
there is only one question that's coming up right now, and it says, from whom do you request the RSA or P vouchers, P1, P2 vouchers?
Oh, okay. So I think it depends on the situation, but the place to request that from would be, first of all, your school, if it's your school that hasn't been providing the services. And it's a little bit hard to answer this with a generic answer. You can also ask up the chain if you're in a public school and the school isn't really responding, you can go to the superintendent's office. At the end, we'll go through some emails that you can also use. If you're at a private school and you've asked the private school, you can also and should also ask the CSE, and they may be able to help you with it. But just keep asking up the chain, because I would say this is true across the board in our educational rights trainings, but a lot of times even really well-meaning people are giving parents incorrect information. So if they're saying, oh, you can't get an RSA in April, you could have only gotten that in November or whatever, I don't know. I'm always amazed at the things people will pass along without realizing it's not correct. Just keep asking up the chain. You know, the basic right is if your child has these services on their IEP and they didn't receive them in full during the school year, you have a right to get those made up. And so, you know, you don't necessarily have a right to a private provider that you want if the DOE can make them up in a way that makes sense. But the DOE can't say, we're going to make them up every day at 7 in the morning, and you can't get your child to school at 7 in the morning. That's not usually what they're saying, but just, you know, putting out an example, you have a right to have them made up and to have it be reasonable, and you should have received those services in the first place. Okay. Okay, so what if there's a problem? So the first thing is informal dispute resolution. This should hopefully be obvious, but you want to start with the school, the parent coordinator, and the principal. I would also say, just in general, if you have allies in a school, people you trust, talk to them too. So if you have a great relationship with I don't know, the social worker or a therapist there, you can talk to them about the situation and try to get some guidance for how to resolve something. If that's not working, you can go to the district superintendent's office. There should be a family support coordinator or a district family advocate there. Essentially, the superintendent is the supervisor of the principal. So that's a good place to go up if you're not getting things resolved at the school level. And then after that, you can try the central offices. So there's a central special ed number, or you can try these two emails, specialeducation@schools.nyc.gov or related services at schools.nyc.gov. I think one thing to keep in mind is a lot of times schools feel like I don't have the ability to hire a provider. I don't have any more money in my budget. I can't do this, but they don't realize that it's not just their budget, it's the DOE's budget, and the DOE as a whole may have resources that they can help funnel to a school to make sure a student gets served. Some superintendents really get this. Some superintendents don't understand special ed as well. So that's why we have all three of these here. And it certainly makes sense to just keep asking, keep really good records, and make sure you can try to explain, you know, why you think your child didn't get what they were entitled and what it is that you want. No, so let's say that doesn't work, or you want an increased rate or a specialized provider. You want prompt speech, and they're giving you a speech therapist who's never heard of prompt, who doesn't work with kids on the spectrum, who has no idea, at least as far as you can tell, what they're doing. You can certainly fight that, and sometimes you might end up in a more formal hearing for it. The three general kinds of formal hearing, and I realize there's one that I didn't put on here, but mediation, which is a voluntary meeting, and the school has to agree. This is often really helpful if you're trying to work out something with a school where things have just gotten really tense. So for example, they're pulling your child out at the wrong time, or they're pushing in instead of pulling out. They have the provider, but there's just a disagreement about it and it's gotten heated. A mediator can often help because they hear everybody's side. They can try to work things out. And it doesn't, rankle anybody in quite the same way that filing a hearing can. Filing an impartial hearing, though, is certainly a right that a lot of parents use, where you have a right to ask for an impartial hearing officer who's an independent hearing officer to make a decision. Its hearings, unfortunately, are taking a really long time now, and that whole process is in flux right now. But at an impartial hearing, you present your case. The DOE sends an attorney or a representative and they present their case. The hearing officer makes a decision. There's evidence. It's not a formal trial like a courtroom, but it's a lot more formal than an IEP meeting, for example. You're going someplace, you do openings and closings, cross and direct. Parents certainly do these cases on their own, especially if it's a pretty simple issue. And a lot of times when parents file, the DOE eventually resolves them. The problem right now is how long these proceedings are taking to get resolved. And even if the DOE offers to settle, I would suggest getting something in writing as quickly as possible. So if they offer to settle for an RSA at an increased rate, don't sign off on that until you get the actual RSA at an increased rate. It's a piece of paper, but you need that piece of paper, because if you're just agreeing to a promise to do something, it might take even longer. A state education complaint you can certainly ask about too, where you're asking the New York State to investigate if you're not getting, not getting the services on your IEP, not getting the related services, not getting sets or a para, not getting transportation. Those are all really actually pretty clear violations of federal and state law. So sometimes asking state ed to help can work. In this case, I think the easiest way to explain it, it's kind of like going to the attorney general's, you're asking somebody else to advocate on your behalf. So the state education department is going to investigate what's happening with the city, but you're not in control of it. So for example, the state education department could say, you're right, you didn't receive any of your physical therapy for a year. And our solution will be have an IEP meeting and figure out how many sessions it would take to make up for that. You'd be like, wait, wait a minute, what are you talking about? They missed 50 sessions of PT, but the state education department might defer to the DOE to hold an IEP meeting and say, oh, well, we think, 15 will make up for it. Hopefully they wouldn't do anything, that extreme, but it is something to keep in mind that you have less control over it. A similar thing that I didn't raise here, but I think is important to know, is the federal government also has an equivalent of the state education complaint through their Office of Civil Rights. And we do have information about that on our website. Some of the questions we received before through the Eventbrite registration were about students in private schools, special ed private schools, where they were not receiving all of their services. And I think in that situation, sometimes a state complaint or an OCR complaint might make the best sense. Okay, so just 2 more slides and then we're happy to answer any questions that people have. Summer Rising is coming back. We don't have a lot of details on it. They're saying that it's going to be a lot better this year for students with disabilities. I'm hoping it is, because there was a lot of room for improvement last year. that's what we know. We are going to try to have a training on this soon. And the DOE, I think, just posted a training that's going to include summarizing. I think it's next week. It might be the 25th. So check the DOE website. It's a special ed forum that covers a lot of things, but the very last item at like 8:30 to 9 o'clock at night or something is summarizing. That's actually what they did last year. And that's when a lot of parents were asking a lot of questions. So certainly, I think what we would encourage you to do is ask questions early, ask for what you think your child needs, keep exploring things, and see if you didn't get what your child needed during the pandemic and the special education recovery services didn't make up for it, certainly you should ask for it now. And that's something to consider. We did have a training on special education recovery services that is posted on YouTube that you can look at as well. I think the biggest complaint last year about summarizing, well, actually there were a few, but one of the big things we heard is people didn't bother to sign up for it because there was no transportation and they had no way to get their child there. One thing you should know is under the federal law and state law, you are entitled to transportation if it's on the IEP and it's a DOE program that they're offering. So this had to do with issues with bus contracting and other things, but certainly push for it, ask for it. Don't take no as the first answer and keep asking. And hopefully it'll be a better story this year. So last but not least, please take our survey. I think I've plugged it a few times. We used to be able to get emails and names through Zoom, but Zoom in their infinite wisdom stopped that. So even if you've registered through Zoom, actually, I think through Eventbrite, we may have your emails, but please take our survey, put in your name, but also let us know how we did, because we really do take the comments seriously. We want to know what worked, what didn't work, and what other trainings you'd like to hear. Okay, and then finally, this is our helpline that I talked about in the beginning, and also our email that you can reach out to us. Okay, so it looks like there's a couple of forms. Oof. Okay, the first question from Sierra is, I have RSA forms, but I can't find therapists. My child hasn't had his PT services all year long. First of all, I'm really sorry to hear that. As a parent of a child who really, really needs PT, or he already has a progressive condition, but without it, it progresses a lot worse and a lot faster. I'm so sorry. It's hard to make that up, but you certainly have a right to make it up. I think in terms of finding therapists, I would reach out to info@advocatesforchildren.org. If you haven't found therapists, send us a list of who you've tried. And certainly you can also email related services at schools.nyc.gov. That's in the training, and ask them to send you a list. Or send you somebody. And I think that's what I would recommend. I also think if you've missed a whole year, trying to be as creative as possible and also stretch it out, because for many students with disabilities, it's not like you can just add on 2 extra hours at the end of the day. Your child has a disability, they're going to be tired. So trying to figure out how that could work. And that is something where that's a pretty serious violation. So maybe there's something else that you can figure out during the summer, you could ask them to pay for, but definitely write into us and let us know what you've tried to do, and we'll certainly try to help. A lot of times what we do for public school parents is we'll write into DOE centrally about a situation. So a parent has tried to find a provider, has asked, all different ways, and has been told no, really hasn't found anybody. We'll email and say, can you help? And I really wish that the parents got the same answer when we didn't do it, but sometimes it helps when we email. And I think they know, because there's attorneys behind us that if they're unable to resolve it, we're going to try to find an attorney to sue for it. But it is something that I think the DOE does try to help. Okay. Great. And I guess that's it for questions, right, Liliana? Did I miss anything, or Karen?
I think they're all answered. We'll wait a few minutes. I think we'll probably turn off the recording for that. And for everyone who's still listening, I placed the survey in the chat box. You can click on it and complete it if you'd like to do that. And up to you, Kim.
Okay, can people see the chat box? They can now.
You should be able to.
Okay. Oh, okay. Let me try this too. If you're having any trouble seeing it, somebody very nicely said, thank you so much for the informative presentation. I'm going to respond. Oh, maybe you can't see the response. Anyway, I'm trying to respond with it. Okay. Well, thank you so much for coming. I hope it's helpful. And certainly please let us know what other information you'd like to know, what you felt like was helpful in this. If there was something where you're like, I can't believe you went on so long about that. Everybody knows that. Please let us know. We really want to make these trainings as efficient and as informative as possible for you. So thanks so much for joining us and have a good afternoon.